If you think your business is in great shape now, this episode is for you. Blockbuster had 9,000 stores, 65 million customers, and the most dominant brand in home video. They never asked what could break their model. 2 years later, the stock was down 91%. So, do you know what it would actually take to break yours? That's what we're discussing today on education.
So today we're going to be talking about how to stress test your business model. We have a couple of examples that we're going to be going over today, but a business model that only works when everything goes right is not a business model. For instance, we'll take a look at Blockbuster. They had 9,000 stores at their peak, 65 million customers that were registered, 800 million late fee revenue per year. 50 million was Netflix buyout offer in 2000, and Blockbuster laughed that off. And then they had a 91% share price decline by January 2010, ultimately closing everything but one store in Bend, Oregon. Blockbuster had everything. They just never stress test what it was built on. So what is a business model stress test? It's not pessimism, it is engineering. The question is, what would you have to be true for this business to break? So a lot of people do this. Banks will do it. PE firms will do it. The 3 CFO flags, which is over-reliance on debt, weak recurring revenue, infrastructure mismatch, and then why owners avoid it. But these are a lot of things that a lot of potential buyers like to look at, and these are kind of the items that we were speaking to before in our last couple episodes on kind of what to look at, especially, I don't know if you remember from our, I believe, second or third episode when we talked about the production system of Toyota. But every major company has done this, and everybody usually finds success within this. This just kind of helps you find all the blind spots and helps you adjust to, in real time before, things actually catch up to you.
Yeah, and even as on the last episode and on previous types of content we've done, we talk about over reliance on a specific customer.
Mhm.
Obviously, those are things that as private equity firms, they're looking at different scenarios of your company. They're going to try to see what would break down in your business. They're going to run different financial models, and so it's good for you to have a good understanding of what could break in your business and understanding some of these risk factors as well, so that not only are you able to mitigate those risks internally, but also as you do look to find a buyer, those things are already addressed, or you can because they're going to do it through a private equity firm or whatever buyer. They're going to be looking at these models. They're going to try to break it down themselves. But if you already know what could happen, and you can help alleviate those concerns, and already have a your response made over those scenarios, you can because they're just putting the stuff on spreadsheets. They're getting some due diligence information from you. So the more prepared you are on that front, the more you can assuage any concerns from a buyer as far as the risk factors are concerned. So that could be things as simple as a not quite a stress test, but like a break even analysis of your model. And again, if I have a customer that's 10 to 20% of my sales, if I lose them, what happens to the business? Things of that nature are going to be critical for you to understand. When I sell, what the buyer could potentially be risking on their end when they take it over. So,
And real quick, before we go on to the next, I just want to say finding problems isn't a bad thing. I know a lot of owners like to avoid it, but usually finding problems is a good thing because that means you're actually going to be able to fix what could occur or what could arise. And if you find them and you're able to fix them before a potential buyer comes in, then that just makes your overall value go up a little bit more. So we'll take a look at our first case study here with Blockbuster. Once again, I think it's astonishing the fact that they had $800 million in late fee revenue. I think that's just kind of crazy. Oh, you guys not turning in your Blockbuster videos.
yeah.
And that was,
this is for people interested in, business and business case studies. This is obviously one of the prime ones that was brought up, from the 2000s. A lot of people are, somewhat familiar with the, well, obviously everyone knows who Blockbuster is, but as far as the behind the scenes stuff, there's a lot of understanding that they had an opportunity to buy Netflix and turned it down, laughed at it, and there has been some discussion on some of the late fee revenue, but it actually is truly astonishing, as Christian has mentioned.
800 million.
15% of its total revenue was from late fee revenue, and from a CFO perspective, I mean, that's just straight cash flow. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
all things, take all the other negative aspects away from it. You have 800,000 in revenue that is purely being driven straight to the bottom line.
800 million.
Excuse me, 800 million. Yeah, exactly. So, so it seems like a really appealing number, but as we we'll talk later, and ends up becoming a sore part of frustration for its customers.
Mm-hmm.
And but the management team sees that number just going straight into cash flow, and you don't really think too much of it.
Yeah. And so if the late fee, disappeared, the stores became pretty unprofitable. And then once the stores become unprofitable, then you have your models start to collapse. And, they could have foreseen this coming when they did try to fix it. The CEO cut late fees in 2005, and they launched Blockbuster online. So once again, this is like during kind of like the .com era. It was working. Then the board ousted him and reversed the course. So, kind of a hindsight 20 is 2020. That I think was definitely a mistake. Netflix's offer was they had a $50 million buyout in 2000. The CEO laughed. I mean, today Netflix is worth a lot of money. I can't even remember how much they have now, but
I think they're right around 300 billion in market cap. I think the we had a correction on it says 380 on the slides here, but for those watching, but I think we did a check. I think that was as of maybe the end of last year. So right as of this episode, around 290, 300 billion, I believe, in market cap. But that aside, I mean, that's an insane number. Obviously, Netflix had it, a stratospheric and somewhat of a obviously disruptor in the space. But Blockbuster had their chances. But because of the appeal of this late fee revenue that is really just pure profit being driven to the company, the idea of switching to something else, a part of it, as we will get into, some of it was they were a little over leveraged, I believe, which prevented them from being a little bit more nimble as they tried to get into the online space for online rentals and that sort of thing. So obviously, Netflix was ahead of the curve, but Blockbuster had the infrastructure in place to be able to support both models. But when you're so dependent on a line item on your income statement that's tied squarely onto the frustration of your customers, that ends up being pretty negative aspect overall. Whereas I think they were trying to switch to a subscription model similar to that of Netflix, where instead of paying a late fee, I'm paying turn that negative into a positive, where you're still able to get a club model or subscription model type of recurring revenue, but in a way that provides more customer value than the negative aspect of like, oh, I return my VHS or DVD late, and all of a sudden I'm being dinged with these late charges.
Stephen, you're completely right. I mean, when they launched Blockbuster online, the subscribers grew so fast it was actually competing with Netflix at the time, which is pretty incredible. But the late fee cut and the online investment crushed short-term margins. That's kind of what Stephen was talking about. Carl Icahn holding a big stake and board seats wanted to cut spending, and he wanted late fees back. After a bonus fight, the CEO, Inico, exited in 2007, and then Jim Keyes reversed his strategy, and the company had the answer, and the incentives overrode it. So, Blockbuster's failure wasn't that they didn't know. It's that the organization incentives prevented them from acting on what they knew. So really, it's kind of a good core lesson there.
Yeah, and that's sometimes especially in the public markets where you have quarterly earnings reports, there's sometimes there's perverse incentives to punt on long-term planning for the support of short-term earnings calls. So obviously this ended up being obviously a big case study that everybody knows, but a pretty big mistake. And I think obviously in hindsight, with some of these investors that wanted to override this late fee aspect, that time, Netflix was still in its early stages. I don't think people truly understood the potential impact they were going to have onto the marketplace within the video rental industry and eventually, um, you know, direct streaming. So, you see, you see this, big line item being taken away and shrunk and, impacting margins. And again, also making it unable to, support debt onto the company. And all of a sudden you're hamstringing yourself. And, instead of that long-term strategic thinking, you're getting impacted by, the short-term profit-driven mindset. So, unfortunate case there, but the key thing is really, how do we, translate this, type of issue that Blockbuster had to your existing business. Um, so a couple questions that you could ask yourself is, what's your equivalent of a late fee? Do you have a revenue stream that's built on, customer inertia or lack of alternatives? So, um, if a competitor remove that friction tomorrow, does that impact your revenue model? And, that answer can, impact, how or demonstrate how exposed you actually are.
Yeah, the next one is if a well-funded competitor entered your market tomorrow at 20% lower the price, what is your defensible position? Is it brand? Is it relationships, quality, or speed? If the honest answer is I don't have to match their price, you're in a commodity position, not a strategic one. And the last one is, do you have organizational incentives that might prevent you from acting on a stress test result, even if you ran one? So that could be bonus structures, ownership agreements, comfort, habit. Blockbuster's problem wasn't knowledge; it was the inability to act on it. And from 50 million to what 300 billion, that's like a 600 or 6,000 time swing. So it's a pretty big one to miss. We'll go on to we'll talk about a little bit about the 5 stress test scenarios. So, for our listening audience, once again, we have a good slide up here. Highly recommend going to the YouTube to take a look at it. Run these on your business, write these answers down, and don't rationalize them. So, for instance, the first scenario is revenue shock. Revenue drops 30% for 90 days. How long can you cover fixed cost? What is your cash floor?
Yeah. So, expanding on this, as we had talked before, maybe it might be your customer concentration mix. Um, that could be, 1 to 2 of your top 2 customers leaving. Could be, maybe it could be a systemic thing that's not necessarily particular to your business, but obviously, like, COVID scenario happens, your sales go down 30%. Um, how does that impact your business? So it's a combination of, as far as de-risking, you know, can I ensure that I'm not being over reliant on any specific customer, and then also, is my cash position strong enough where I can withstand those downturns in a way that I'm meeting my fixed costs, being able to keep my guys employed, and meet my overhead, everything, so that I can weather that downturn and be able to rise up once things recalibrate themselves. So for the second one, key person loss. So this is obviously, especially for small businesses, can be a major risk. Obviously, you as the business owner are very likely key to the critical to the company. But outside of that, even do you have a manager or longstanding
Salesman.
employee, or someone with technical know-how that they only know for your business? But your best person leaves tomorrow. However you want to categorize that. What would break? What's undocumented? Is there any domain expertise that they have that's not you know you know decentralized throughout the rest of the company? Or in the case of a sales guy or account manager, what customer relationships
Mhm,
could potentially leave with them? So again, could be a top sales guy, could be a
mhm.
manager person, a deeply qualified technician that understands all the core operations and very nuanced things of your operation, that if they were to leave, could you know deeply impact your business.
The next one is scenario 3, which is customer concentration. Remove your top 3 customers. So once again, we mentioned this before in prior episodes, but if you have customer concentration, let's say you have 3 people accounting for 25 to 30% of your revenue. If one of those guys leaves, that's going to be a pretty big hole or gap to kind of follow, and it's or to fill, I should say. And usually they have what's known as like kind of a PE rule, which is no single customer above 20%, meaning that you're kind of spread or diversified within your client base and not totally reliant upon one contract. And if that one contract does leave, you know, where does your revenue land?
Yeah, and in terms of ways to mitigate this, obviously you can't overnight change your customer mix. That's obviously a very difficult thing to do. But again, as you know, presumably you have a few years left running this business. You're listening to our podcast and our resources, and you're thinking about that down the road. Is there a way to help mitigate these risks? Another one could just be, um, even if I do have this high concentration risk, do I have you know, really solid, longer term contracts with them that do provide that runway for a potential buyer where I know they're going to be locked in for at least a couple of years, and
Hmm.
that'll give that buyer some confidence that you know that they're going to be with the company for after your departure, and there's some um, and I still have some time to develop around that, or maybe this is being brought into a portfolio company or a strategic acquirer that also has a wide mix of customers to where it's not, they're able to cross sell to your other customers so that, it's diluting that high concentration of, those top customers, different ways where they can think about how that would be de-risked. But, yeah, definitely something to keep your mind on. It's a little bit more of a specific scenario than scenario one, where that's kind of a more general,
Hmm.
downturn. Whereas this is, looking at our top customers, because it very well could still end up being 30% of a sales
Yeah.
dip. Ideally would be less, but again, really just depends on how you're situated. So
Yeah. The next one is cost spike. So your biggest cost increased by 25%. Can you pass it on? What happens to the margin if you can't? So, for instance, if you're within an industry that's very driven by, a good example for here would actually be oil. So, let's say a lot of your products are created by, hydrocarbons or oil-based products. If that price of oil rises, are you able to pass that along to your customers, or and let them kind of take a little bit of the hit, or do you have to take the hit? And if you do have to take the hit, obviously your margins are going to decrease, and that can obviously overall lead to a kind of a revenue shock within what we said the first scenario. So it's always really important to keep an eye on costs. We've talked about this a lot of times before. Actually, I think in episode 1 or 2 we discussed this, but it's always a good thing to be able to see exactly where you stand, especially within your competitors. If you're in a restaurant game, and let's say Chick-fil-A moves next door to you, that's your competition. If Chick-fil-A is selling a chicken sandwich for, $10, actually Chili's does a really good job of this. So like Chick-fil-A, they sell a meal for like 10, $12. Let's say the price of chicken rises. Obviously, they're going to have to increase their costs because they run at pretty thin margins to begin with. And then you look at what Chili's has done, they've tried to actually lower their cost to increase their volume to actually be able to bring in more customers. And they've had a really good job, a lot of success actually doing this and listening to the customers on what they want.
yeah, and again, case by case, I mean, tariffs, obviously, that
Yeah.
was that's a big one that has been topical over the past year or two, where you know you're importing something that costs spikes, and depending on the industry you're in, you may not be able to pass all of that off to the customer, because maybe you're in a global marketplace, and it's everybody, or you have a product that has alternatives or substitutes where they're able to somebody else may be able to buy a different product, and it may not be the same thing but gets enough of what they need out of it. So again, just something to keep in mind. It could be a supplier that you know suddenly spikes their price, and all of a sudden you're not able to switch to a new supplier in a you know very really agile amount of time, and it's a you're producing a fairly unique or niche industry where you can't really move on to something else, and you can't necessarily pass that cost along. Now, very case specific, but something to identify within your company.
The last one is, which is scenario 5. Competitive disruption. Funded competitor enters at 20% lowered price. What is your defensible position? What do they do that, like, you can't replicate? So for instance, this could be a brand. So if you're in a small town, for instance, you have a known trusted um, reputation where if somebody calls on you, they know they can call on you day or night. They know that the problem will get solved. If it doesn't, they can trust you to come back out and give them a fair quote and keep working on it until it's actually solved. Um, it can be actually a lot of different things, but really is you have to figure out why people would still choose you rather than the cheaper option. And as we know, sometimes cheaper isn't always the best, but it all really depends on what you decide is your defensible position. In this case, I think we discussed this actually within the Blockbuster one. Um, but anyhow,
Yeah, it's you know, that's where you really have to start looking into your differentiators and being able to, especially if you can't, bring your pricing down, and ideally you shouldn't need to. Um, you know, a lot of times it's either the Starbucks competing against the local coffee shop. It's
mhm,
historically the Walmart coming in and uh,
right,
hurting local
yeah,
suppliers, and in some cases there's it's such a gigantic force. There's not much you can do, but in a lot of cases there is you got to find a way that you can turn that into a differentiator. Obviously, there is increasingly local support for small businesses. So if there is a
buy
larger
local, support
competitor,
local.
yeah. So it's leaning into those aspects of your company and being able to provide. A lot of times the easiest thing is just being unrivaled in the service you provide, the customer experience, and those sorts of things that can really elevate you and enable you to still command that premium even if somebody comes in at a lower price.
Yeah, you do see this a lot within like the food industry. Like a lot of farmer markets, people will go to those and pay a little bit extra because they may know that uh, maybe they don't use pesticides, or this is kind of where the whole organic kind of troop came from. And this is actually a good one to explain this to, is actually Whole Foods. I mean, you got people spending like $20 on an orange from Whole Foods because it fits whatever niche items that they want it to fit, whether it be quality, organic, non-GMO, whatever it is. That's the actual selling point, and that's their justifiable cost. And that's what people like to think.
So as we think through these points, ideally you can start getting a framework of what a really resilient company can look like. So a few factors that we've brought up here: recurring revenue, gross margin buffer, cash reserve, customer diversification, documented processes, and pricing power. So we'll just go into each one by one.
Yeah, so recurring revenue, this is your kind of your subscription or contracts or repeat business. So the higher percentage, the more predictable you are, the more defensible you are, and ultimately the more valuable you are because you have that sort of sum coming in. So this was, you can think of it as its base roots, such as, the Netflix, Hulu's, HBO Max. That's why a lot of those companies are moving over to that sort of platform, because they found that's what the consumers want, and they can sell it based off an actual subscription agreement. Now, more on to kind of like what your business is. This could be there's like a lot of home businesses where you could pay them to like a servicing contract. So once you install like an HVAC unit or you do a roof or whatever, you can sell them a maintenance package where they'll come out, and they'll continually check on things, maybe move you up on the list. So if something does break, you get a little bit more of a premium selection or more preferred time. It could be within the medical business. I know we are dealing with a physical therapist now, and he actually uh, started doing a maintenance package for people post,
Or 10 visit or 20 visit,
10
if they
visit,
had
20
a
visit, post injury, post surgery, and they will actually build the, maintenance off of whatever your daily tasks are or activities. So if you like to play pickleball, they'll focus on that, golf, so forth and so on.
yeah. So increasingly, with the subscription or obviously contractual revenue, you may have commercial cleaning contracts, or again with HVAC, you may have a service agreement, service contract. You're seeing in this concept being increasingly brought into, obviously we've talked about software as a service as a business model, but you're starting to see these subscription type service models being introduced in a lot of different um, capacities and industries, and it's specifically to get that predictability and a lot of valuation can, it's very appealing to buyers, and it gives you, that comfortable, predictable revenue, um, and assist with the second point, which is the gross margin buffer. So if you have enough margin where you can, absorb cost increases before having to raise prices, it, just gives you a lot more room to work. If an input cost does go up 25%, you're in a better position to take that on than a competitor that may have a lower gross margin profile, or enables you to, handle that shock and potentially position yourself to, handle more business because you're in a more competitive, you know, you're more competitively differentiated, or you have, the cash to support, additional growth. Whereas that other competitor that's, weak on their margin, is cash constrained, and that becomes their, entire focus. So being able to use that, to your advantage is a key thing there. And again, with the cash reserve, similarly, if especially if there's this systemic downturn where it's impacting all businesses, if you're well, cash positioned, it allows you to come out from that, downturn into a much more competitive environment, because there, a lot of companies in that same predicament that weren't cash, that didn't have good cash reserves, are now weak. They're going to end up losing market share. Some may even go out of business, and that
Hmm.
puts you in a position to really capitalize on that when things start to correct.
Yeah, you'll know you'll be able to make payroll, cover whatever expenses you may incur, so forth and so on. But we'll go to the next one, which is customer diversification. We've really discussed this once again. You don't want a single customer that accounts for 20% or more of your revenue. Really, if you do that, it's a structural risk, and it's no longer really a sales number. But we won't go too far into that again. But the next one is documented processes. So that's kind of what we were discussing above. If the key person leaves, what happens? I know it's such a big risk that, I mean, you have insurance companies selling key person insurance. So it's definitely something that you need to document to, make the business a little bit more transferable and easier. Because if you're coming in as a buyer, if a manager leaves, or, a technician leaves, and he's the one that's kind of running the show, you're going to be kind of screwed because you have to find somebody that can be able to fix everything all at once.
Yeah, and that could turn into, needing to, vastly overpay for, somebody else to come in. There's a lot of different, knock-on effects that can
Hmm.
do it. In some cases, the key person can be, you know, so instrumental to the business that it's a, potential death knell to the company. So definitely need to make sure that you know, you have a team and structure in place within your organization, and again, the process is documented to avoid or at least mitigate some of those issues.
The last one is pricing power. Can you raise prices 10% without losing significant customers? If not, you're a commodity. So once again, we like to make sure that you are doing something that's going to make sure that people are still going to be able to use you or continue to want to use you. Think then about this organic. Think about kind of chilies. Just those are some good examples. I know we discussed that before. I'm not trying to go too in depth again on this to avoid, repeating and redundancies. But we'll go on to the next one, which is our 30-day stress test action plan. Uh, so for the first week, we'd like you to run, 5 scenarios with honest numbers. Write the answers down. Don't rationalize what you find. And what we mean by don't rationalize, just when you tend to rationalize things, you're not seeing it as an honest picture. You're seeing it more as a viewpoint than just something that can be fixed. Uh, the second week, we'd want you to identify your 2 biggest failure points. These are your priorities, not your to read list. So, once again, to go back to that first one, we need an honest picture of what's happening within your business. And if you can't be honest about what your 2 failing points are, then you can't fix what's actually going wrong. And once you do, and you are honest with yourself, then those two biggest points are the ones that you're going to need to fix immediately, because oftentimes if you fix them now, you won't, whenever things go bad, you won't need to feel them later. So it's kind of more of a preventive measure than anything. And once again, this will allow you to become a little bit more valuable down the line, because if you can show a repeatable process with, recurring revenue and, not a strong dependency on a client or a key person, then that's ultimately a perfect buy for whoever is looking to purchase. Week three, build one specific action item for each, not a goal, an action. So reduce top customer from 40% to 25% in 12 months. So once again, we were talking about removing your uh, or reducing your client concentration from that 40% to 25%. And it just kind of helps you, because, change, in order to change, you need to have something to do. Otherwise, if you don't change and you do the same thing, then you're going to have the same results. So you need to have something that you can try to change for this. And that's why we say it's not a goal. You need to do this. So if your customer concentration is 40%, you need to reduce that to 25% to prevent any sort of failures.
Yeah, and it's again, you probably need to break this into smaller actions too, and to develop a roadmap. Obviously, you're not going to just saying I'm
Yeah.
going to reduce 40% to 25%. It's got to be and that can be accomplished by a few different ways. Obviously, increasing sales with your other existing customers is obviously one way to do that, and then obviously adding new customers into the fold. So a lot of that could be a function of sales, and increasing your sales. Obviously, we're not trying to just cut off. Obviously, you want to keep the sales, that 40% number on a pure raw number basis. You're trying, if it's $1 million customer, you're not trying to bring it down to 700,000 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's all things equal, if I'm raising your sales of my other customers and also bring in more customers where I'm able to reduce that number, that's where that number can be brought down. But it could be, I'm going to increase the sales of my other 60% of my customers. I'm going to raise the sales of those collectively by 10%. Well, that gets you from 40% down to 30%. Then it's also I'm adding 5% new sales over that year too, something like that, where you're able to and then even more finely break that down. But again, that's just specific to the customer concentration. Could be I need to build up my cash reserves over this year to make sure that I can support a downturn, and what steps do I need to take to ensure that happens.
Or we need to come up with a maintenance agreement for our current clients to make sure that we come out and service them. But it definitely needs to be actionable, which ties into our last one, which is find an accountability buddy, as the kids say. Share the results with someone you hold accountable. This could be a partner, advisor, or board member. The test doesn't work if it only lives in your head. And I think it would also, I'd like to expand upon this a little bit. I think it also would be helpful too if you maybe discuss this. So if you, for instance, want to increase your servicing or touch points with past clients or current clients, you can actually go and discuss this with your team members and say, hey, I know we're falling short on actually touching with our clients and getting them to move over to a service agreement. I'd like to see this number, or we need to change this number, or at least increase it by 10% or whatever that may be. So at least you're sharing these clear ideas. Once obviously you have them down with a partner, an advisor, or a board member, that your team knows your specific goals, because if you don't have a specific actionable item for them to achieve, then it's kind of hard for them to read your mind. So that's the conclusion to episode 5 of education. Once again, Blockbuster had everything they needed to survive. They just never stress test the model they built. So thank you guys for listening so much.